Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet moments hide the deepest secrets. Tonight's tale unfolds slowly, the way real mysteries do, through small habits, careful words, and the things people assume no one notices. There are no sudden shocks here, no rush to judgment, only the calm certainty that every village, every family, and every familiar place carries a truth beneath its surface. Settle in, breathe easily, and allow the story to take its time with you. Listen closely, because in these stories, it is not what is spoken loudly that matters most, but what is said softly and remembered. Chapter 1. The first remark reached Miss Marple before she even set her case down. It was spoken lightly by the landlady as she fussed with the register, the sort of comment meant to fill space rather than meaning, yet it lingered in the air longer than it should have. She said that the village had become much quieter since people stopped using the old back road, and she laughed in a way that suggested agreement was expected. Miss Marple smiled politely, as one does when hearing a harmless observation, yet she noticed that the woman's fingers tightened on the pen as she spoke, pressing the nib hard enough to blot the page. Miss Marple had come for a quiet visit, or so everyone believed. The village itself appeared much like any other, neat and measured, with hedges trimmed to a respectable height and windows washed regularly enough to signal order. It was the sort of place where habits were treasured and deviations politely ignored. The newer road curved conveniently past the shops and the post office, offering smooth passage and open sightlines. And the old lane, by contrast, lay behind the cottages, narrower, softer underfoot, edged with hawthorn and elder that leaned in as though listening. By the time tea was poured that afternoon, Miss Marple had already heard three explanations for why the lane was no longer used. One woman said it had grown muddy and inconvenient. Another insisted it led nowhere useful anymore. A third claimed it was simply forgotten, overtaken by progress. Each explanation ended with the same small laugh, quick and tidy, as though the sound itself sealed the matter shut. Miss Marple accepted these remarks with gentle interest, yet she observed how often eyes shifted sideways during these conversations, checking who else might be listening. At Mrs. Linton's table, the teapot steamed comfortingly, and the plates were set with care. Mrs. Linton prided herself on domestic order, and it showed in the straight placement of her teaspoons and the precise fold of her napkins. Yet when she stirred her sugar, she did so with an unnecessary vigor, sending small white grains onto the saucer. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Linton did not brush them away, as she ordinarily would have. Instead, she left them scattered, her hand trembling slightly as she spoke of village matters. Mr. Pritchard, seated nearby, contributed little. He was a solicitor by trade and habit, a man accustomed to weighing words before releasing them. Miss Marple observed that whenever a cart passed along the newer road, rattling faintly in the distance, his eyes flicked toward the window, then returned to his cup as though nothing had happened. He smiled when spoken to, but the smile arrived a moment too late, like an afterthought. Conversation drifted toward harmless topics: weather patterns, a new delivery of flour, the vicar's sermon length. Yet the old lane crept into the talk regardless, mentioned obliquely, never directly. Miss Marple did not introduce it herself. She had learned long ago that the most revealing remarks were often volunteered, not prompted. A child at the neighboring table, a thin boy with earnest eyes, spoke suddenly while swinging his feet beneath the chair. He said that the lane was where people went when they wished not to be seen. His voice was clear and matter-of-fact, as though stating a simple rule of geography. The sentence had barely left his mouth before his mother hushed him sharply, her hand coming down on his arm with more force than the correction required. She laughed then, loudly, explaining that children had wild imaginations. Miss Marple noted the boy's puzzled expression, the way he looked from face to face, as if uncertain why his statement had caused such disturbance. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk. She did not announce her destination, nor did she carry herself with any air of investigation. She strolled as an elderly lady might, pausing to admire hedgerows and remark upon late blossoms. The old lane lay quiet, its entrance partially hidden by overgrown grass, yet not so neglected as to suggest true abandonment. The earth was soft from recent moisture, holding impressions easily. She noticed the broken twig first, snapped cleanly rather than weathered. Nearby, pressed into the soil, was a heel mark, sharp at the edge, as though made by someone who had placed their foot carefully, testing their weight before stepping fully. It was not an old impression. The earth had not yet crumbled at the sides. Miss Marple did not linger, but she committed the sight to memory with practiced ease. On her way back, she encountered the vicar's wife, who greeted her with warmth that bordered on enthusiasm. The woman spoke at length about parish duties and the comfort of routine. When Miss Marple mentioned, quite casually, that she had nearly wandered down the old lane, the vicar's wife laughed brightly and said there was nothing of interest that way. She added with a firmness that contradicted her smile that no one had used that road in years. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on. Yet she noticed that the woman watched her leave, her expression tightening once she thought herself unobserved. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, listening to the village settle. Sounds carried differently at dusk. Doors closed softly, voices lowered. Somewhere, a gate clicked shut. She reflected on the pattern forming quietly in her mind. Not a conclusion, merely a shape, like the outline of a familiar object glimpsed through fog. The following morning brought more small confirmations. At breakfast, the landlady remarked that someone must have walked the old lane the previous night, as her dog had barked for an unusually long time. She dismissed the thought at once, blaming foxes, yet Miss Marple observed that she did not meet her guest's eyes while speaking. At the post office later, a queue formed more slowly than usual, as though people were reluctant to arrive too early or linger too long. A woman ahead of Miss Marple spoke in a hushed voice about a letter gone astray, then stopped abruptly when she realized she was being heard. Miss Marple listened, asked gentle questions about stamps and collection times, and noted how carefully answers were phrased. She noticed, too, that the postmistress aligned her parcels with particular attention, as though precision offered reassurance. A faint scent of lavender lingered near the counter, unexpected in a place dominated by paper and ink. By midday, gossip had begun to circulate, thinly veiled as concern. Someone mentioned that Mr. Lionel Arkwright had not been seen on his usual morning walk. Another remarked that he was a man of habits and did not change them lightly. These comments were exchanged with polite nods, yet Miss Marple noticed how quickly the topic shifted, and as though everyone feared lingering too long might invite questions of their own. She encountered Mr. Pritchard again near the green. He greeted her courteously and remarked on the pleasantness of the weather. When Miss Marple observed that the village seemed unusually quiet, he agreed at once, then amended his statement, adding that it was always quiet. The correction came too quickly, as though rehearsed. In the afternoon, she returned to the lane, this time stopping just short of its entrance. A pair of footprints now overlapped the earlier heel mark, lighter, hurried. Miss Marple did not need to examine them closely to know they were new. She stepped back onto firmer ground and adjusted her shawl, appearing merely to rest. As she turned away, she heard voices behind her. Two women approached, speaking softly. They fell silent upon seeing her, then laughed and remarked upon the beauty of the hedges. Miss Marple smiled and wished them a good afternoon. As they passed, one of them said, a little too loudly, that there was no reason for anyone to go that way anymore. Miss Marple agreed, her tone pleasant, and walked on. That evening, the vicar's wife called upon her, bearing a small plate of cakes. She spoke warmly, offering advice about walks and village customs. She emphasized more than once that the old lane was best avoided, citing uneven ground and brambles. Miss Marple thanked her sincerely and accepted the cakes. After the woman left, Miss Marple examined the plate and noticed a faint smear of soil on the edge, incongruous against the polished china. She did not draw conclusions. She never did so hastily. Instead, she allowed the details to rest together, observing how they leaned toward one another, forming quiet connections. A lane declared unused, fresh marks in soft earth, voices that lowered, habits disrupted, explanations repeated too neatly. As night fell, Miss Marple sat comfortably, hands folded, her expression serene. Outside, the village lay calm beneath the stars, presenting itself as orderly and untroubled. Yet she understood with gentle certainty that calm was often the surface beneath which the most deliberate actions took place. And as she prepared for rest, Miss Marple smiled kindly, knowing she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 2. The first sign that something was being carefully managed came not from a raised voice or a sudden commotion, but from the way the teacups were set down. That Miss Marple noticed it at once when she entered the Bluebell tea room later that morning. The cups touched their saucers with unusual softness, as though everyone had agreed without speaking to avoid even the smallest sound. It was the sort of collective behavior that passed unnoticed by most, yet to Miss Marple it suggested tension rather than tranquility. Calm, she had long observed, did not need such deliberate handling. The tea room was a narrow place, long windows overlooking the newer road where carts passed at predictable intervals. Lace curtains filtered the light, and the air carried the familiar scents of baked bread and warm milk. Miss Marple took her seat near the wall, placing her gloves neatly beside her cup. She did not rush. She never did. Villages revealed themselves best when one allowed them to speak in their own time. See, Mrs. Linton arrived shortly after, her smile fixed carefully in place. She greeted Miss Marple with enthusiasm that felt rehearsed, and took the chair opposite her. As she poured tea, her hands trembled just enough to cause a thin stream to miss the cup's rim. She laughed it off, blaming the heat of the pot, yet she did not meet Miss Marple's eyes. Miss Marple murmured something agreeable, and observed how Mrs. Linton adjusted her grip twice before setting the pot down, as though correcting an error she could not afford to make again. Conversation began pleasantly enough. The weather, a late delivery of sugar, the vicar's wife and her endless meetings. Yet beneath these ordinary exchanges ran a current of something unspoken. Miss Marple listened with the patience of someone accustomed to hearing more in what was left unsaid than in what was offered freely. At the table beside them, two women spoke in hushed tones. One mentioned that Mr. Lionel Arkwright had not attended the market for several days. The other replied that he was likely resting, as his wife had said. The reply came too quickly, and Miss Marple noticed the slight pause afterward, as though the speaker had realized she had spoken from instruction rather than belief. Their voices dropped further, and soon the conversation shifted to preserves and sewing patterns. Miss Marple took a sip of tea and allowed her gaze to wander. The floorboards near the counter bore a faint scrape, darker than the surrounding wood. It was not old enough to have been worn smooth, yet not new enough to stand out starkly. She imagined a chair drawn back suddenly, perhaps in surprise or haste, and then replaced with care. Such marks, she knew, often remained after moments people wished to forget. The waitress, a young woman with quick movements and an anxious habit of smoothing her apron, approached to refill the milk jug. When Miss Marple thanked her, the girl startled slightly, then smiled with an eagerness that bordered on relief. Her eyes flicked toward the door before returning to her task. Miss Marple noted that the bell above the door had not rung in several minutes, though she could see a cart passing outside. Mrs. Linton spoke then of the old lane, though she did not name it directly. She referred to it as the back way, saying it was overgrown and inconvenient. Her tone was light, yet she tapped her spoon against her saucer repeatedly as she spoke, each tap precisely the same distance apart. Miss Marple commented mildly that such paths often held memories longer than people expected. Mrs. Linton laughed too loudly at that and changed the subject at once. A moment later, a remark drifted from the far end of the room. Someone said that the lane was best forgotten, as nothing good had ever come of it. The sentence was followed by a ripple of polite agreement. Miss Marple observed how several heads nodded in unison, a gesture of consensus rather than conviction. When the waitress returned with a plate of scones, Miss Marple noticed a folded slip of paper protruding slightly from her apron pocket. It was quickly tucked away when the girl realized it had been seen. Miss Marple did not comment. No, but she noted how the waitress's hands shook as she set the plate down. A faint scent of lavender followed her, incongruous among the smells of butter and tea. As the morning wore on, the tea room filled and emptied with quiet efficiency. Miss Marple listened as gossip flowed and ebbed, catching fragments that others dismissed. Someone mentioned that the post office had stayed open later than usual the previous evening. Another remarked that a light had been seen near the hedgerow long after dark. These observations were quickly explained away, attributed to mistakes or imagination. Miss Marple paid her bill and rose slowly, gathering her gloves. As she passed the counter, she paused, commenting on the neatness of the shelves. The owner smiled proudly, yet her smile faltered when Miss Marple mentioned how carefully everything was arranged, as though nothing had been moved in some time. The woman assured her that things were always kept just so, but Miss Marple noticed a single sugar jar, slightly out of alignment with the others. Outside, the day had brightened, though the air remained cool. Miss Marple walked along the newer road, observing the regularity of its traffic. She noted who passed and who did not. Mr. Pritchard emerged from his office briefly, speaking to a client with professional calm. When he noticed Miss Marple, he inclined his head politely, yet his eyes lingered on the lane's direction before returning to her. She turned down a side street and found herself near the post office. The door stood open, and inside, the postmistress was sorting letters with deliberate care. Miss Marple greeted her and remarked upon the pleasantness of the morning. The postmistress agreed, though her voice held an edge of strain. She mentioned, unprompted, that there had been some confusion with deliveries recently, letters turning up in unexpected places. Miss Marple expressed sympathy and observed that such things happened more often in close-knit communities. The postmistress smiled, yet her fingers tightened around a bundle of envelopes. Miss Marple noticed that one bore a faint smear of purple wax, barely visible against the paper. When she commented lightly on the fragrance in the room, the postmistress flushed and said she favored lavender sachets to keep moths away. As Miss Marple left, she heard the bell ring behind her. The postmistress closed the door quickly, though another customer approached moments later. Miss Marple did not turn back. She had already seen enough to consider. In the afternoon, she encountered the child from the tea room again, this time playing near the green. He greeted her openly and asked if she had found the lane. Miss Marple replied that she had seen it. He nodded gravely and said his mother did not like him to talk about it. When Miss Marple asked why, he shrugged and said, "Grown-ups became cross when reminded of things they wished were forgotten." His mother called him away sharply, and he ran off without another word. Miss Marple continued her walk, passing Mrs. Linton's house. Curtains were drawn, though the hour was early. From within came the sound of hurried movement, a chair scraping, then silence. Miss Marple slowed slightly, adjusting her pace to appear unremarkable. She noticed a faint trail of sugar crystals on the front step, leading inward. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to her lodging. The landlady mentioned that someone had asked after Miss Marple earlier, though she had not caught the name. Miss Marple thanked her and asked casually who had called. The landlady hesitated, then said it was a woman from the village, someone concerned about visitors walking where they ought not. Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild. Later, as she sat with a book she did not truly read, Miss Marple reflected on the day. The tea stirred too quickly, the chair scraped and replaced, the folded note, the lavender scent. None of it pointed clearly to wrongdoing, yet together they suggested orchestration rather than accident. Outside, the light faded gently. Somewhere, a door closed with care. Miss Marple folded her hands and smiled faintly. She understood that villages, like people, often believed silence to be protection. And as she prepared for rest, she felt certain that someone somewhere was already regretting a conversation they had thought unnoticed. Miss Marple smiled kindly, knowing she had just stepped closer to the shadow of murder. Chapter 3. The remark that morning was offered as a kindness, which was precisely why Miss Marple paid such careful attention to it. It came from the landlady as she passed the breakfast table, remarking that Mrs. Arkwright would surely be pleased to know Miss Marple was enjoying the village, as she herself rarely entertained visitors anymore. The sentence was spoken lightly, yet it ended with a small tightening of the lips, as though the speaker had nearly said something else and thought better of it. Miss Marple thanked her and continued stirring her tea, noting how often concern in villages disguised itself as courtesy. The Arkwright house lay at the far edge of the village, its garden backing onto the very lane everyone insisted no longer mattered. Miss Marple set out after breakfast, choosing a route that allowed her to appear merely interested in flowers and hedges. She paused once to admire a particularly healthy rosebush, and again to adjust her shoe, all the while observing who noticed her presence and who did not. The garden gate stood slightly ajar when she reached it, an ordinary enough detail, except that Miss Marple sensed it had been left that way deliberately. Mrs. Arkwright appeared almost at once, as though she had been watching from inside. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, too warmly perhaps, and suggested she come no farther, as the path was uneven. Miss Marple assured her she was quite steady on her feet and admired the neatness of the borders. As they spoke, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Arkwright kept one hand hidden behind her back, pressing her fingers hard into her palm. The gesture was unconscious, repeated whenever the conversation drifted too close to her husband. Mrs. Arkwright mentioned that Lionel had been unwell, plagued by headaches and fatigue, and that he preferred to rest upstairs. She spoke with care, choosing each word as though it had weight. Miss Marple expressed polite sympathy and remarked that illness so often upset household routines. Mrs. Arkwright agreed quickly. Syed then corrected herself, saying that nothing had truly changed. Miss Marple smiled gently and commented on how difficult it must be to keep everything just so under such strain. Mrs. Arkwright's smile faltered, then returned brighter than before. While they talked, a handyman arrived carrying a small toolbox. He greeted Mrs. Arkwright respectfully and began examining the gate latch. Miss Marple watched with mild interest, observing the ease with which he removed a small piece of metal and replaced it with another. He remarked, without thinking, that the latch had been altered recently, and that it was a curious choice, meant more to prevent entry than to secure animals. Mrs. Arkwright laughed softly and said her husband liked to feel safe. The handyman nodded, yet his brow furrowed briefly, as though the explanation did not quite satisfy him. Miss Marple asked whether the gate led anywhere in particular. The man replied that it opened toward the old lane, though no one used it now. He said this last part quickly, glancing at Mrs. Arkwright as he did so. As the handyman worked, Miss Marple noticed a smear of dark wax on the ironwork near the latch. It was small and easily overlooked, yet it did not belong there. Wax, she knew, traveled only when pressed against something deliberately. She made no comment, merely asking whether letters were often delivered to the back of the house. Mrs. Arkwright replied at once that all deliveries came to the front door, then added a little too firmly that there was no reason for anyone to approach from the lane. Miss Marple thanked her for the conversation and took her leave, remarking on the pleasantness of the garden. As she walked away, she heard the gate click shut behind her with careful precision. She did not turn back, yet she could feel Mrs. Arkwright's gaze lingering. Further along the lane, Miss Marple paused near the hedgerow, pretending to examine the berries. She noticed that the ground here was less disturbed than nearer the village, as though footsteps avoided this stretch deliberately. Yet close to the Arkwright gate, the soil bore faint impressions. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to suggest repeated passing. A little later, she encountered the postmistress returning from her rounds. They exchanged greetings, and the postmistress remarked upon the inconvenience of houses at the edge of the village. Miss Marple agreed and mentioned that such locations often allowed for privacy, and the postmistress smiled thinly and said privacy was overrated, then glanced toward the lane and adjusted her grip on her bag. By midday, Miss Marple found herself near the churchyard. The bell had rung earlier than usual, and a few parishioners lingered, exchanging news. Miss Marple listened quietly as one woman mentioned seeing a light near the Arkwright house late the previous night. Another replied that it must have been a mistake, as Lionel Arkwright was supposedly confined to bed. The exchange ended there, neither woman wishing to press the point. Miss Marple wandered among the headstones, noting the familiar names and dates. Near the yew trees, she observed a patch of soil that appeared darker than the rest, recently disturbed and carefully smoothed over. It was not a grave, nor anything so dramatic. No, yet it spoke of something having been placed there and concealed with intention. She did not linger, but the image stayed with her. In the afternoon, she called briefly at the post office. The postmistress greeted her with forced cheer. and spoke at length about sorting delays. Miss Marple noticed that her ink-stained finger bore a fresh mark, darker than before, as though she had handled the same stamp repeatedly. A letter lay on the counter, sealed with lavender-scented wax, its address neatly written, yet incomplete. When Miss Marple asked about it, the postmistress said it was misaddressed and would be returned. She slid it away quickly. As Miss Marple left, she heard raised voices from the back room, quickly lowered. A moment later, the postmistress emerged alone, her expression composed. She apologized for the interruption and mentioned that villagers had been unsettled by recent gossip. Miss Marple replied kindly that gossip often flourished where certainty was lacking. Later, at Mrs. Linton's house, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea. Mrs. Linton was more composed than the day before, yet she avoided mentioning the Arkwrights entirely. When Miss Marple did so herself, remarking on the beauty of their garden, Mrs. Linton's spoon paused midair before continuing its slow circle. She said that Mrs. Arkwright kept to herself these days, and that such reserve was understandable. During the visit, Miss Marple noticed a small key resting on the mantelpiece, incongruous among the ornaments. It was old and finely made, the sort one might keep close, rather than display. When Miss Marple commented on it, Mrs. Linton flushed slightly and said it belonged to no one in particular, merely an old thing found in a drawer. She moved it out of sight soon after. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked once more toward the lane, stopping short of its entrance. She heard voices ahead, low and urgent. They ceased abruptly when she appeared, and two figures emerged, laughing too loudly as they passed. Miss Marple recognized one as the handyman. The other she could not see clearly. She returned to her lodging as dusk settled. The landlady mentioned that Mrs. Arkwright had telephoned earlier, asking whether Miss Marple had enjoyed her walk. Miss Marple thanked her for the message, noting the concern implied. Upstairs, she sat quietly, reflecting on the day's small revelations. The altered latch, the wax on iron, the disturbed soil, the sealed letter. Each detail was slight, easily dismissed. Yet together they suggested communication, movement, and careful concealment. Miss Marple did not yet know who was afraid or of what. She only knew that fear had begun to shape behavior. Outside, the lane lay dark and still, presenting itself as forgotten. Miss Marple smiled faintly, understanding that such places were often chosen precisely because everyone agreed to stop looking. And as night settled fully over the village, she felt certain that whatever had been arranged in quiet corners was moving steadily toward consequence. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 4. The first irregularity appeared not in the service itself, but in the pause before it. Miss Marple noticed it as she took her seat in the small stone church that Sunday morning. The congregation had settled with their usual precision, coats folded, hymn books open to familiar pages. Yet the vicar lingered at the lectern longer than necessary, his fingers resting on the wood as though steadying himself. It was a small hesitation, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple observed how several heads lifted at once, then lowered again, as if everyone sensed something unnamed, but chose not to acknowledge it. Church in villages such as this was not merely an act of faith, it was a ledger of presence. Who attended, who did not, and who was spoken of afterward carried meanings far beyond the hymns. Miss Marple sat quietly, her posture relaxed, her attention keen. She had long known that people revealed themselves most clearly when they believed they were behaving correctly. The service proceeded with familiar comfort. Voices rose and fell together, smoothing over individual thought. Miss Marple watched hands rather than faces. She noticed how Mrs. Linton clasped hers tightly during the prayers, her knuckles whitening, then relaxed them too suddenly when the hymn began. She saw Mr. Pritchard turn a page before it was needed, then correct himself, glancing around as though hoping no one had noticed. When the vicar came to the announcements, the air shifted again, subtly. He read the list of names for the upcoming parish charity supper, thanking those who had offered dishes or assistance. Miss Marple noted a faint change in his tone halfway through, almost imperceptible, yet distinct to anyone listening carefully. There was a name missing. She could not have said immediately whose, but the absence registered as clearly as a dropped note in music. After the final hymn, the congregation spilled into the churchyard, forming clusters that rearranged themselves with practiced ease. Polite greetings were exchanged, observations about the weather made. Miss Marple moved slowly among them, offering smiles and brief remarks, allowing others to speak. She heard someone comment that Mr. Lionel Arkwright had not been seen at church for weeks. Another replied that his wife said he was unwell, and that one must respect privacy. The reply carried an edge of insistence that discouraged further comment. Miss Marple walked toward the yew trees, admiring their age and solidity. Beneath them, the ground appeared darker, the soil disturbed and then smoothed again with care. It was not the sort of disruption caused by children at play or animals passing through. Someone had taken pains here, and equally taken pains to conceal those efforts. Miss Marple paused only briefly, then continued, aware that lingering invited notice. Near the vestry door, she encountered the vicar's wife, who greeted her with affectionate concern. The woman spoke warmly of parish matters, her voice steady, her smile unwavering. When Miss Marple remarked upon the beauty of the grounds and the quiet of the surrounding paths, the vicar's wife laughed lightly and said that some routes were better left unused. She added, almost as an afterthought, that the back lane near the church was unsuitable for walking and should be avoided. Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, though she observed the firmness beneath the remark. As the churchyard gradually emptied, Miss Marple overheard a choir boy speaking to his friend. He mentioned that a gentleman had visited the vestry late one evening earlier in the week, asking questions in a hurry. When Miss Marple approached, the boy flushed and said he must have been mistaken. His friend tugged at his sleeve, urging him away. Miss Marple smiled at them kindly, making no attempt to press the matter. Yet she noted the speed with which innocence had been corrected. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her lodging to find the landlady unusually occupied with dusting. She remarked that the vicar's wife had been in earlier, asking whether Miss Marple intended to attend the charity supper. The question was relayed with casual interest. Yet Miss Marple sensed that the inquiry had carried greater weight at the time. She assured the landlady she would attend if invited and thanked her for the information. After a light luncheon, Miss Marple walked toward the village center. The bells were silent now, the streets calm. At the post office, she noticed a small group gathered just outside, speaking in low voices. They dispersed quickly upon seeing her. Inside, the postmistress greeted her with careful cheer and spoke at length about the efficiency of the morning's collections. Miss Marple listened, noting how the woman avoided mentioning the church entirely. On the counter lay the parish ledger, temporarily placed there for the vicar's review. Miss Marple glanced at it with mild interest, remarking upon the neatness of the entries. She noticed that one date had been overwritten, the ink slightly darker, the handwriting marginally different. When she commented lightly that keeping records must be a challenge, the postmistress replied too quickly that accuracy was essential. Her fingers hovered over the ledger as though guarding it. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back outside. Across the street, Mrs. Linton stood speaking with another woman, her voice lowered. When Miss Marple approached, the conversation ended abruptly. Mrs. Linton greeted her with forced brightness and commented on the length of the sermon. Miss Marple replied agreeably and remarked that church always revealed much about a community. Mrs. Linton laughed, then said nothing further. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Pritchard near the green. Now he spoke of legal matters in general terms, mentioning that he had been busy with estate planning recently. Miss Marple observed that such work often required discretion. Mr. Pritchard agreed, his expression tightening briefly before smoothing again. He added that some matters were best settled quietly, without attracting attention. They parted politely, and Miss Marple continued on her way. Near the edge of the church grounds, she noticed footprints leading toward the back lane, partially obscured but unmistakable. They were not old enough to belong to some distant past, nor fresh enough to suggest the morning. She considered the timing, then moved on, content to let the thought rest. In the early evening, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to take tea at the vicarage. The table was laid with care, and conversation flowed easily enough at first. The vicar's wife spoke warmly of parish unity and the importance of trust. Miss Marple listened attentively, noting how often the woman returned to the subject of harmony, as though reinforcing it might make it so. When Miss Marple mentioned that she had admired the churchyard earlier, the vicar's wife stiffened almost imperceptibly. She said the grounds were well tended and that no one had any reason to linger there after dark. Miss Marple nodded and commented on how places of worship often bore witness to private moments as well as public ones. The remark was met with a tight smile and a swift change of subject. As dusk fell, Miss Marple walked slowly back toward her lodging. She passed the church once more and paused near the gate. The disturbed soil beneath the yew trees lay undisturbed now, its surface smoothed and unremarkable to the casual eye. Miss Marple understood the impulse behind such care. Order reassured. Disorder invited questions. From the lane beyond, a faint sound reached her ears, the soft closing of a gate. She did not look in that direction, choosing instead to adjust her shawl and continue walking. She had already learned what she needed for the moment. That night, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected on the day. The missing name from the list, the altered ledger entry, the soil disturbed and concealed. Each detail was modest, almost trivial in isolation. Together, they suggested deliberate omission rather than accident. Villages, she knew, often believed that what was not spoken ceased to exist, and they trusted in silence as though it were a virtue rather than a strategy. Miss Marple sat quietly, her expression calm, her thoughts active. Somewhere between the church and the lane, something had been deliberately erased, and as she extinguished the lamp, Miss Marple felt certain that the act of removal mattered far more than whatever had been taken away. Miss Marple smiled kindly in the darkness, knowing she had just watched the shadow of murder grow longer. Chapter 5. The first disturbance of the day arrived folded neatly, as though it wished to appear harmless. Miss Marple became aware of it when the postmistress called at her lodging just after breakfast. Her visit announced not by urgency, but by politeness carried a little too far. She apologized twice before sitting down, adjusted her handbag with unnecessary care, save and said at once that there was nothing truly wrong. Miss Marple invited her to speak, her tone mild, her attention complete. The matter, the postmistress explained, concerned a letter that did not quite belong anywhere. It had been discovered behind the sorting table, wedged so precisely that it might have been placed there intentionally. It bore no proper address, only a surname written with deliberate neatness, and it had been sealed with lavender-scented wax. The postmistress laughed faintly as she mentioned the scent, remarking that people were sentimental about such things. Miss Marple noticed how her fingers lingered on the clasp of her bag as she spoke. Miss Marple accepted the letter when it was offered, turning it slowly in her hands. The paper was of good quality, uncreased, as though it had never passed through ordinary channels. The wax seal was intact, pressed carefully, yet the edge showed a slight imperfection, a tremor in the pressure that suggested haste, disguised as care. A single grain of sandy dirt was embedded in the wax, pale and fine. Miss Marple did not comment on it at once. She opened the letter with measured calm. Inside was a short message, written plainly, asking the recipient to meet at the back lane at dusk. The tone was firm but courteous, promising a financial arrangement and urging discretion. There was nothing overtly alarming in the words themselves. Miss Marple had seen such letters before, in one form or another, dressed as opportunity rather than threat. The postmistress spoke quickly, saying she could not imagine who had written it, or to whom it was meant. Then she added that the village was not accustomed to such secrecy. Miss Marple murmured agreement and asked gently whether misdirected letters were common. The postmistress replied that mistakes happened, then corrected herself, saying they rarely did. Miss Marple smiled kindly and returned the letter, thanking her for bringing it. After the postmistress left, Miss Marple sat quietly, holding the image of the letter in her mind. Lavender, she reflected, was often chosen for its association with calm and cleanliness. It soothed, it reassured, it suggested harmlessness. Those who used it relied on its reputation. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked toward the village center. She encountered Mrs. Linton outside the grocer's shop, examining apples with more attention than necessary. They exchanged greetings and misses. Now Linton remarked that there had been talk of unusual letters circulating. The comment was offered lightly, yet Miss Marple noticed how her voice dropped on the word unusual. Miss Marple replied that villages were full of correspondence, most of it mundane. Mrs. Linton nodded, though her eyes searched Miss Marple's face as if seeking confirmation. As Miss Marple continued on, she passed Mr. Pritchard's office. The door stood open and voices drifted out briefly before falling silent. Mr. Pritchard emerged moments later, his expression composed. He greeted Miss Marple and remarked that legal work often brought one into contact with people's private difficulties. Miss Marple agreed, observing that money had a way of creating urgency. Mr. Pritchard smiled thinly and said nothing more. At midday, Miss Marple returned to her lodging for luncheon. The landlady mentioned that gossip was spreading about Mr. Lionel Arkwright, some saying he had been seen in town, others insisting he was too ill to leave his bed. Miss Marple listened, asking no questions, noting how certainty fractured when repeated too often. In the afternoon, Miss Marple walked toward the edge of the village, choosing a path that brought her near the back lane without committing her to it. She paused near the hedgerow, as she had before, and observed the ground. The earlier impressions remained, though softened by time. Nearby, a new disturbance caught her eye, a narrow scuff where someone had hesitated, then turned away. Miss Marple imagined a figure arriving with intent, then reconsidering. As dusk approached, Miss Marple took a seat where she could observe without being obvious. She watched as a figure approached the lane entrance, stopping just short of it. The person stood there for several moments, shifting weight, then turned back abruptly and walked away. Miss Marple could not see the face clearly, yet the posture spoke of indecision and unease. She returned to the village as evening settled. Lights appeared in windows, one by one, offering the illusion of warmth and transparency. At the post office, she noticed that the door was closed earlier than usual. The lavender scent lingered faintly in the air nearby, carried perhaps on someone's clothing. That evening, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at Mrs. Linton's house. The table was laid with particular care, and Mrs. Linton appeared eager to discuss domestic matters. Miss Marple listened, noting how often her hostess returned to the subject of order and propriety. When Miss Marple mentioned letters and communication, Mrs. Linton stiffened slightly, then laughed and said she preferred speaking face to face. During the visit, Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Linton's hands bore faint ink marks on one finger, darker than those of ordinary correspondence. When asked about them, Mrs. Linton replied that she had been helping the vicar with parish notes. Miss Marple accepted the explanation, yet stored the detail away. As she left, Miss Marple noticed a small pile of ash near the hearth, finer than usual, with a hint of purple amid the gray. She remarked lightly on the warmth of the fire. Mrs. Linton agreed quickly, and closed the door with more force than necessary. Back at her lodging, Miss Marple sat by the window, reflecting on the day's quiet movements. The letter had been an invitation, but also a test. Someone wished to see who would come and who would hesitate. The scent of lavender had been chosen to soothe, to disarm suspicion. Yet fear, Miss Marple knew, was not so easily calmed. She considered the grain of sand in the wax, the one place where the letter's careful construction had failed. Sandy soil was not common throughout the village. It belonged to a specific stretch near the lane, where the ground changed subtly beneath the hedgerow. Whoever had sealed the letter had done so there, perhaps hurriedly, perhaps believing no one would notice. Later that night, the landlady knocked softly at Miss Marple's door. She said that someone had called earlier, asking whether Miss Marple intended to walk that evening. Miss Marple thanked her and said she had remained in. The landlady hesitated, then said the caller had seemed disappointed. She could not recall the name. Miss Marple sat quietly after the landlady left. The pattern was becoming clearer, though still incomplete. Messages delivered and withheld. Meetings arranged and abandoned. Fear layered beneath politeness. Outside, the lane lay dark and still, its reputation intact. Yet Miss Marple understood that roads, like letters, were meant to connect, not disappear. Someone had been using both with care, believing that subtlety would ensure safety. As the clock struck the hour, Miss Marple folded her hands and smiled gently. She sensed that the invitation contained within the lavender-sealed letter had not been meant merely to summon, it had been meant to control. And as the village settled into its careful sleep, Miss Marple knew that the next revelation would not come written on paper, but carried instead by those who believed their secrets had already burned away. Chapter 6. The change announced itself at supper not through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but through appetite. Miss Marple noticed it the moment she entered the parish hall that evening. Plates were filled generously as tradition required, yet many remained barely touched. Forks paused mid-air. Cups were lifted and set down again with unnecessary frequency. The room was warm, the lamps steady, the chatter suitably cheerful, and yet something essential was missing. People were present in body, but not in attention. The charity supper was one of the village's most reliable rituals. Attendance was expected. Contributions were noted. Absences were discussed later with polite concern. Miss Marple took her seat near the end of one long table, placing her napkin neatly across her lap. She smiled at those around her, offering mild remarks that invited conversation without demanding it. In such settings, she knew, listening mattered far more than speaking. Mrs. Arkwright arrived alone. Her entrance was quiet, yet Miss Marple observed how several heads turned at once, then looked away. Mrs. Arkwright moved with composed dignity, greeting acquaintances with practiced warmth. She explained before anyone asked that Lionel was feeling poorly, and had insisted she attend without him. The explanation sounded prepared, delivered with a firmness that discouraged follow-up questions. Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Arkwright's smile wavered only when she thought no one was watching. She took a seat across the room, positioning herself carefully as though mindful of who sat nearby. Miss Marple noticed that she avoided sitting close to Mr. Pritchard, though space remained. Instead, she placed herself near the vicar's wife, whose presence offered immediate respectability. The choice was sensible. Miss Marple filed it away. Conversation began with familiar ease. Compliments were offered on puddings and roasts. Someone joked about the unpredictable weather. Laughter followed, a little louder than necessary. Miss Marple listened, observing the rhythm of speech, the timing of pauses. She noticed how certain names were avoided, and how others were repeated with artificial enthusiasm. At the far end of the table, a man remarked lightly that debts had a way of ruining even the most orderly households. The comment was framed as humor, yet it landed awkwardly, causing a brief stillness. Mr. Pritchard smiled thinly and replied that financial matters were best handled privately. His tone was smooth, yet Miss Marple observed the tension in his jaw. Mrs. Arkwright lifted her glass, then set it down untouched. She glanced toward the door twice within a few moments, as though expecting someone to enter late. Each time, her shoulders stiffened before relaxing again. Miss Marple watched her carefully, noting how effortful the calm appeared. As plates were passed, a tray slipped from someone's grasp and clattered softly to the floor. There was a collective intake of breath, quickly followed by reassurances and polite laughter. Miss Marple bent to assist, her movements unhurried. As she did so, she noticed a small object slide out from beneath the tablecloth, skidding a short distance before coming to rest near her shoe. It was a key. Not a large one, nor particularly ornate, but finely made and old, its metal worn smooth by frequent handling. Miss Marple picked it up and examined it briefly before offering it to the woman beside her. The woman flushed and said, "It must belong to someone else." Miss Marple smiled and said such things often appeared where one least expected them. She set the key discreetly on the sideboard, where it remained unnoticed by most. Miss Marple did not need to know its purpose yet. The fact of its presence was enough. As the meal continued, gossip flowed more freely, buoyed perhaps by the effort of pretending ease. When someone mentioned that the back gate at the Arkwright house had been repaired again, another replied that such attention to security was unnecessary in a village like theirs. Mrs. Arkwright laughed softly at that, though the sound did not reach her eyes. Miss Marple leaned toward her neighbor and remarked gently that frequent changes often suggested dissatisfaction rather than improvement. The woman nodded vaguely, then glanced toward Mrs. Arkwright and said nothing further. The vicar's wife rose to speak about charity and forgiveness, her voice warm and reassuring. She spoke of community, of looking after one another, of avoiding unnecessary speculation. Miss Marple listened with interest, noting how the speech seemed aimed at calming rather than inspiring. Forgiveness, she knew, was often invoked when someone feared judgment. During the dessert course, Miss Marple noticed that the handyman from earlier in the week had arrived late and seated himself near the door. He ate little and spoke less. When someone mentioned the lane, he stiffened, then quickly resumed his meal. Miss Marple observed the exchange without comment. Later, as people rose and moved about, Miss Marple found herself near the sideboard once more. The key remained where she had placed it. She noticed Mr. Pritchard glance at it briefly, then look away. Mrs. Linton passed by and slowed slightly, her eyes flicking toward the object, before she continued on. No one claimed it. Miss Marple remarked to the woman beside her that keys had a way of revealing their owners eventually. The woman laughed uncertainly and said she hoped so. As the evening drew on, conversations fractured into smaller groups. Miss Marple joined one such cluster near the window. A woman spoke of how unsettled she felt recently, though she could not say why. Another replied that change always made people uneasy. Miss Marple suggested mildly that it was often secrecy, rather than change, that disturbed the spirit. The remark was met with polite silence. Mrs. Arkwright approached Miss Marple then, her expression composed. She thanked her for attending and remarked that Lionel would be sorry to have missed such a pleasant evening. Miss Marple replied kindly, expressing hope for his recovery. She added casually that illness often made people crave fresh air. Mrs. Arkwright hesitated, then said Lionel had not been outside in days. Her voice faltered slightly on the word days before steadying again. Miss Marple smiled and said rest was important. As Mrs. Arkwright moved away, Miss Marple noticed her hands trembling faintly, as they had earlier in the week. As chairs were stacked and goodbyes exchanged, Miss Marple stepped outside into the cool night air. She lingered briefly near the door, observing departures. Mr. Pritchard left quickly, avoiding conversation. The handyman remained behind, speaking quietly with the vicar's wife. Mrs. Arkwright stood alone for a moment, looking toward the lane beyond the hall, then turned and walked briskly home. Miss Marple returned to her lodging at an unhurried pace. The landlady remarked that the supper had seemed subdued. Miss Marple agreed, saying that food tasted different when people carried worries. The landlady nodded, and then said she had heard someone moving near the back lane earlier that evening. She dismissed it at once, laughing nervously. Miss Marple thanked her and went upstairs. In her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, considering the evening's quiet revelations. The untouched food, the unclaimed key, the repeated glances toward the door. None of it constituted proof, yet each detail added weight to the pattern forming in her mind. She thought of the key and its likely lock, the back gate perhaps, or something closer to the lane. Keys were symbols of access, she reflected, of permission granted or withheld. Someone had lost control of theirs, if only briefly. Outside, the village settled into sleep. Lamps dimmed, doors closed. Somewhere, a gate was opened and shut again, the sound faint but distinct in the stillness. Now, Miss Marple did not rise to look. She had learned that watching too closely sometimes altered behavior. Instead, she folded her hands and allowed her thoughts to settle. The supper had been intended to reassure, to demonstrate unity and normalcy. Yet it had revealed the opposite. Too much care had been taken. Too many things left unsaid. Miss Marple smiled gently to herself, understanding that when a village stopped eating together with ease, it was rarely because of indigestion. It was because something indigestible had already occurred. And as the night deepened, Miss Marple felt certain that the key she had seen tonight would soon unlock far more than its owner intended. Chapter 7. The discovery was spoken of first as an inconvenience. Miss Marple heard it from the landlady while she was pouring tea, the sentence delivered with the careful softness people used when they wished to believe something dreadful could still be made ordinary. She said that there had been some trouble near the old back road that morning. Nothing for concern, only a delay while matters were sorted out. Miss Marple thanked her calmly and observed how the woman avoided using any specific words, as though naming the thing might give it substance. By the time Miss Marple stepped outside, the village already knew. Knowledge moved quickly here, though it rarely traveled in straight lines. It drifted from door to door, altered slightly with each telling, cushioned by politeness and qualification. Someone had been found near the lane, not on it, but close enough that the association could not be denied. Miss Marple walked slowly, choosing a path that allowed her to arrive without appearing eager. She had learned that haste often alarmed people into silence. The lane itself looked unchanged at first glance. The hedgerows still leaned inward. The earth lay soft and dark. Yet Miss Marple noticed the way the grass was pressed down in two distinct directions, as though someone had been carried part way, then lowered with care. It was not the sort of disturbance left by a fall alone. There was intention in it. Someone had tried to arrange the scene into something acceptable. The body lay just beyond the bend, positioned with a curious neatness. Miss Marple did not need to look closely to understand that this had not been an accident. She observed the details others missed. One trouser cuff was clean, the other marked. The shoes were aligned, as though straightened after the fact. The hands rested too deliberately at the sides. A small group had gathered at a respectful distance. They spoke in whispers, exchanging fragments of certainty and doubt. Miss Marple heard the name Lionel Arkwright spoken once, then again, more firmly. His absence from daily routines had been noticed. His illness had been discussed. Now his presence here, in this place everyone agreed, no longer mattered, demanded explanation. Miss Marple stood quietly among them, her expression composed. She did not ask questions. She listened. That, she knew, encouraged others to speak. Someone said Mrs. Arkwright had been seen walking late the previous evening. Another replied that she often walked to calm her nerves. A third mentioned that Mr. Pritchard had argued with Lionel Arkwright some weeks earlier about money. The comment was quickly softened, described as professional disagreement. Miss Marple noted how easily the word argument was replaced by discussion. The constable arrived looking uncomfortable, as though aware that his presence confirmed what everyone feared. He asked for space and cooperation. The villagers complied readily, stepping back, murmuring reassurance to one another. Miss Marple observed how order was restored with remarkable speed. Disruption, she reflected, was tolerated only briefly here. As the body was carefully attended to, Miss Marple noticed a faint smear of lavender-colored wax on the ground nearby. It was small, easily mistaken for something else, yet she recognized it at once. Wax did not belong here naturally. One had traveled only with intention. She also observed that the soil beneath the body differed slightly from that nearby. The ground here was firmer, less sandy. Whoever had sealed the letter had not done so at this exact spot. The movement had occurred elsewhere, then concluded here. The lane, she realized, had been used as a corridor rather than a destination. Miss Marple stepped back as the constable spoke with Mrs. Arkwright, who had arrived pale and tightly composed. Her distress was evident, yet controlled. She spoke of Lionel's ill health, of his desire for privacy, of her own confusion at his absence. Miss Marple noticed that she did not cry immediately. The tears came later, almost on cue, as though summoned when appropriate. Mr. Pritchard stood apart, his expression grave. When questioned, he spoke calmly about recent financial matters. He admitted that Lionel Arkwright had been under strain, but insisted there had been no hostility. Miss Marple watched his hands as he spoke. They remained steady, though his fingers pressed together a little too firmly. The postmistress was among the last to arrive. She appeared breathless, apologizing for her delay. Miss Marple observed the lavender scent clinging faintly to her coat. When she caught sight of the body, her face drained of color, then carefully rearranged itself into concern. Miss Marple noted the speed of the recovery. As the morning wore on, gossip surged despite efforts to contain it. Miss Marple heard the same details repeated, altered slightly each time. She heard speculation presented as certainty and certainty disguised as rumor. Through it all, she listened for what did not change. The letter returned to her thoughts. The invitation to meet at dusk, the promise of money, the warning to come alone. Someone had arranged this meeting with precision. Someone had expected Lionel Arkwright to arrive, or perhaps feared he might not. Miss Marple walked back toward the village center, allowing the scene to recede behind her. At the post office, she noticed the door stood open wider than usual. Inside, the postmistress was sorting letters with deliberate calm. Miss Marple entered quietly and commented on the busy morning. The postmistress agreed, her voice steady, though her eyes flicked briefly toward the lane's direction. Miss Marple remarked that the letter discovered earlier in the week had been unfortunate. The postmistress stiffened slightly and said it was regrettable, though such things happened. Miss Marple observed that the wax seal had been distinctive. The postmistress smiled thinly and said she supposed so. As Miss Marple left, she noticed a smear of lavender wax on the clasp of the postmistress's handbag. It was faint, nearly invisible unless one knew to look for it. Miss Marple did not comment. She had learned that silence often revealed more than accusation. Later, she encountered the handyman near the green. He spoke nervously of his work, mentioning again the altered gate latch at the Arkwright house. He added that he had been asked to adjust it more than once, and that such requests were unusual. Miss Marple nodded and said that fear often expressed itself through hardware. The remark unsettled him more than a direct question might have. In the afternoon, Miss Marple walked toward the churchyard. The disturbed soil beneath the yew trees had been smoothed again, almost obsessively. She understood now that it was not concealment of an object that mattered there, but the habit of concealment itself. Someone had practiced hiding. The village gathered itself as evening approached. Doors closed, curtains were drawn. Conversations ended abruptly when Miss Marple entered a room. She was aware now that her presence was no longer neutral. People knew she noticed things. She accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage, where concern was expressed in carefully measured phrases. The vicar's wife spoke of tragedy and compassion, of the need to avoid speculation. Miss Marple listened kindly, then remarked that truth often emerged, whether invited or not. The vicar's wife smiled, though her eyes remained troubled. As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned to her lodging. The landlady spoke in whispers, saying the village would never be the same. Miss Marple replied gently that villages were always changing, though they preferred not to admit it. In her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, reviewing the day's quiet confirmations. The lavender wax appeared again and again, tying letter, lane, and person together. The careful placement of the body suggested someone who wished to delay rather than conceal discovery. The repeated insistence that the lane was unused now revealed itself as preparation rather than truth. She thought of the key left unclaimed at the supper, access granted and denied, of the altered gate latch, of meetings arranged through suggestion rather than force. Miss Marple did not yet name the culprit. She rarely did so prematurely. Instead, she allowed the final pieces to settle into place, confident that the picture was nearly complete. Outside, the lane lay silent once more, its role fulfilled. It had carried a secret as far as it could, then released it back into the village that believed it had been forgotten. Miss Marple folded her hands and smiled gently, knowing that the quiet arrangements made in that narrow space had finally reached their limit. And somewhere in the village, someone was beginning to understand that the road they had relied upon for secrecy had, at last, delivered them into the light. Chapter 8. The invitation was issued with such ordinary kindness that no one suspected it carried an ending. Miss Marple asked them to come in the late afternoon, some when the light softened and voices naturally lowered, framing the gathering as a small effort to clear misunderstandings before they hardened into rumor. In villages, she knew, people welcomed the chance to believe that confusion could still be smoothed away politely. The sitting room filled slowly, chairs arranged just so, teacups placed within easy reach. Familiar faces settled into familiar habits, each person reassured by the comfort of routine. Miss Marple greeted them all with the same gentle warmth. Mrs. Arkwright arrived first, composed and pale, her movements careful. Mr. Pritchard followed, calm and professional, his expression one of concern rather than alarm. The vicar's wife entered next, bringing with her the air of moral steadiness she carried so well. Finally, the postmistress arrived, apologizing for her lateness, her lavender-scented coat folded neatly over her arm. Conversation began quietly. Miss Marple spoke of the village, of how quickly stories grew once a single detail was misplaced. She remarked on how misunderstandings often survived because no one wished to disturb the surface calm. The others nodded, offering agreeable murmurs. Tea was poured. Spoons stirred gently. The room felt safe. It was only after several minutes that Miss Marple began to speak of small things. She mentioned the back gate at the Arkwright house, altered more than once in recent weeks, and how such changes often suggested anxiety rather than prudence. Mrs. Arkwright's hand tightened slightly round her cup, though she said nothing. Miss Marple went on to speak of the unclaimed key found at the charity supper, remarking that keys were curious objects, often appearing when someone wished to feel in control. Mr. Pritchard shifted in his chair, then settled again. Miss Marple turned next to the churchyard, speaking of the disturbed soil beneath the yew trees. She described it not as evidence, but as habit. A place smoothed over repeatedly, she said, revealed a person accustomed to hiding traces rather than confronting them. The vicar's wife smiled politely, yet her eyes flickered toward the window. Throughout it all, Miss Marple's tone remained warm, almost conversational. She spoke as though sharing observations rather than accusations. She recalled the letter sealed with lavender wax, discovered behind the sorting table. She described the grain of sand embedded in the seal, and how such a detail might pass unnoticed unless one knew where to look. At the mention of lavender, the postmistress's fingers paused on her saucer. Miss Marple noticed, and gently continued. She spoke of how lavender was chosen for its associations: calm, cleanliness, reassurance. She said it was a thoughtful scent, one used by people who preferred subtle influence over confrontation. She remarked that whoever wrote the letter had wished to summon, rather than threaten, to guide events quietly rather than force them. The postmistress laughed softly and said that many people liked lavender. Miss Marple agreed at once, smiling kindly. She added that it was unfortunate how such preferences sometimes became habits, and how habits left traces in unexpected places. She spoke then of the lane, not accusingly, but thoughtfully. She said that roads declared unused often became useful precisely because no one watched them anymore, that the lane had served as a corridor, allowing meetings to be arranged without notice, messages delivered without witnesses, movements made without explanation. She observed that someone had ensured the village agreed, collectively, that the lane no longer mattered. Silence settled over the room, not uncomfortable, but attentive. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the postmistress, not sharply, but with quiet interest. She remarked on the demands of that position, the access it provided, the trust it required, letters handled daily, messages redirected easily, information gathered without suspicion. The postmistress nodded, her smile fixed. Miss Marple spoke of Lionel Arkwright then, of his debts, quietly discussed, of his fear, carefully concealed, of the invitation sent to him, promising resolution if he came alone. She described how fear and hope often made people obedient, how a person under pressure might agree to meet in a place everyone believed forgotten. She paused, letting the room absorb the image. Miss Marple then mentioned the smear of lavender wax on the iron gate latch, and later on the ground near the lane, and finally on the clasp of a handbag. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply connected the details, one by one, as though assembling a familiar pattern. The postmistress's composure faltered at last. Her breath caught slightly, then steadied again. She said nothing. Miss Marple continued gently, explaining how the meeting had been intended to frighten, not to harm. How money had been demanded quietly, repeatedly. How control had been exercised through suggestion rather than force. She described how fear had escalated when Lionel Arkwright resisted, how a confrontation near the lane had turned physical, brief, unintended, and irreversible. She did not describe the moment itself, She did not need to. The postmistress spoke then, her voice low and strained. She said she had never meant for it to go so far. She said she had only wanted him to listen. She said he had fallen, that she panicked, that she arranged the scene to look less deliberate, believing the village would blame the lane rather than her. Miss Marple listened without judgment, her expression compassionate rather than triumphant. She remarked softly that villages often preferred shadows to truth, because shadows allowed everyone to remain comfortable. She said that belief was precisely what had made the plan possible. Mrs. Arkwright wept quietly, so the tension finally released. Mr. Pritchard bowed his head, understanding at last how his own silences had contributed. The vicar's wife murmured something about mercy, her voice unsteady. When the constable arrived later, summoned quietly, Miss Marple did not speak again of guilt or blame. She simply answered questions clearly, offering her observations as one might offer a carefully folded letter. The truth, once assembled, required no embellishment. As evening settled, the room emptied slowly. One by one, the villagers left, carrying with them the weight of what had been revealed. The postmistress was taken away gently, her authority dissolved into something smaller and human. Mrs. Arkwright remained behind for a time, then rose and thanked Miss Marple with trembling sincerity. At last, Miss Marple was alone. She sat by the window, watching the light fade across the hedgerows. Somewhere beyond them lay the lane, quiet once more, its purpose finished. It had been a useful road for secrecy, chosen because everyone agreed not to see it. Now, it would return to being merely a path, stripped of the power it had borrowed from denial. Miss Marple reflected that villages rarely learned from drama, but they sometimes learned from gentle reckoning. The truth had arrived without shouting, without spectacle, and perhaps because of that, it might remain. She poured herself another cup of tea and allowed the silence to settle comfortably around her. There would be talk in the coming days. There always was. Yet beneath the gossip, something had shifted. The village would look more closely now. Not everywhere, not always, but enough. Outside, the first lamps were lit, the windows glowing warmly against the dusk. Life, orderly and familiar, resumed its shape. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her expression kind and thoughtful. Roads were never truly unused, she reflected. They simply waited for the moment when someone believed no one was watching. And with that quiet certainty, she closed the curtain, knowing the mystery had been laid to rest, and that the village, for all its politeness, would never quite forget the lesson carried by the road it once pretended did not exist. The village did not wake the next morning transformed, and perhaps that was the most honest ending of all. Mist still clung to the hedgerows, kettles still came to the boil at their usual hours, and the newer road carried carts past the shops with dependable regularity. Yet beneath these familiar motions, something subtle had shifted, like furniture moved slightly in a darkened room. People noticed the change without naming it. They spoke more carefully. They paused longer before dismissing small irregularities. Silence no longer felt quite so protective. Miss Marple remained for a few days longer, not out of necessity, but courtesy. She understood that endings, like beginnings, benefited from gentleness. When she walked through the village, she was greeted with warmth that carried a new note of respect. No one thanked her directly. Gratitude here preferred to dress itself as politeness. Mrs. Arkwright left the house by the lane soon after, choosing to stay with distant relations for a time. The garden gate was repaired once more, this time without secrecy, and left to swing freely in the daylight. The disturbed soil beneath the yew trees was finally allowed to weather naturally, rain and wind smoothing it without human interference. It was no longer something to be managed. The post office reopened under temporary arrangement, its shelves realigned, its routines restored with deliberate transparency. Letters moved openly again, passed hand to hand with the quiet dignity they deserved. The scent of lavender faded from the counter, replaced by the neutral smell of paper and ink. No one remarked upon the absence. They did not need to. At the parish hall, another supper was held weeks later. The food was eaten with genuine appetite this time. Laughter rose and fell without strain. The unclaimed key was never mentioned, though it found its way quietly to the constable, who placed it among other small objects whose purposes had ended. No one asked what door it once opened. Miss Marple attended that supper briefly. She listened, smiled, and made a point of leaving early. As she walked back toward her lodging, she paused near the entrance to the old lane. In daylight, it appeared no more than a narrow path edged with grass and patience. Birds moved freely there now. The ground bore no recent marks. She stood for a moment, reflecting that places were rarely guilty on their own. They merely waited for people to lend them meaning. The lane had been chosen not because it was hidden, but because everyone agreed to forget it. That agreement, more than any physical concealment, had allowed events to unfold. On her final morning, Miss Marple packed her case with careful efficiency. The landlady hovered nearby, offering provisions and polite concern. Then, when asked whether she would visit again, Miss Marple replied that villages had a way of calling people back when needed. The answer seemed to satisfy. As the train carried her away, Miss Marple looked out at the passing fields and thought of how often trouble announced itself quietly, through habits altered just enough to be noticed by those who knew where to look. She reflected, as she often did, that evil rarely arrived shouting. It preferred invitations, reassurances, and familiar comforts. Behind her, the village settled into its future, altered but intact. It would remember this chapter without dwelling on it, just as villages always did. Yet a few people would glance twice at a quiet path. A few would listen more closely when routine faltered. That, Miss Marple believed, was usually enough. She folded her hands in her lap. A content. Another small corner of the world had been set right, not through spectacle, but through attention. And as the countryside unfolded beyond the window, Miss Marple smiled gently, knowing that truth, once noticed, had a way of lingering, even in the most polite of places.